All right. Welcome in to this session today as we have people joining us. We're going to go through some quick intros for the webinar. And we've got Andy Hanna and Jessica Talisman with us today. Thank you both for joining. My name is Kate Gallo. I'll be your moderator today for this session. The topic of this from taxonomy to trust with data. We know that without taxonomies and ontologies, data systems fail. And without proper data quality and a system to measure that, outcomes fail. So we've got both of these two experts here with us today to run through some questions, both on sort of the thought leadership side of this, but also in practice. So as a reminder, throughout the session, you can ask questions in the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. I will be watching the Q&A the whole time, so I'll make sure our experts answer your questions for you throughout this session. And I'm going to hand it over to Jessica and then Andy for some quick bios and intros, and then we'll kick it off with some questions.
So my name is Jessica Talisman, and I am a semantic engineer, taxonomist, ontologist, information architect, whatever title is trending at the moment. And I have worked in this space since about 1997, and I have worked with very large companies and also cultural institutions over the years, really working to make data findable and retrievable and interoperable. I recently left Adobe and I started my own consultancy, and I'm still working with clients and also coaching folks to help to teach them how to build the ontology pipeline.
Great. And hi, everybody. I'm Andy Hanna. It's great to be with you, Jessica, again for another episode. So great to see you, and thanks, Kate, for organizing this. My background for the past 30 years, I think I go back, just like Jessica does, to sort of early days in data and data science. And most of my work has been with early stage companies using how do we use this data and data science uniquely to solve problems. For example, the last company I co-founded before Blue Street Data was a machine learning company focused on higher education, where we were predicting student behavior. And I spent 2 years after that company was purchased by a large ed tech company running Liaison's AI and data science solutions group. And then I decided that I wanted to solve a problem or focus on solving problems around data, and mostly around third-party data, purchase data, and the opaqueness of that marketplace. I'm also on faculty at the University of Pittsburgh, where I teach business analytics, and I chair the Responsible Data Science Advisory Board for the provost at Pitt. So that's me.
Awesome. Thank you both. I'm our head of marketing and partnerships here at Blue Street Data. I will not be an expert on this call, but just a moderator in this position. So Jessica, I want to hand it off to you first. Can you set the stage for us with, for those of us who are not taxonomy and ontology experts on this webinar, how would you describe what taxonomy and ontology is? Why does it matter? And what does it look like in when organizations ingest that and create data systems?
Sure. So taxonomies are hierarchies. They are information or data terminology normally that's structured, taking a controlled vocabulary, structuring that controlled vocabulary as a hierarchy with parent-child relations. This can be encoded as SCOS, for example, or OWL using an ontology, but many organizations do not do that. Where there's a transitory state that's called a thesaurus, and the thesaurus is where we mature a taxonomy. We have relationships, but we can also capture alternative labels and hidden labels if we're using an ontology to structure a thesaurus. And finally, an ontology in and of itself is a way of describing data. It's a logical reasoning model that breaks out of the constraints of a hierarchical relationship and is able to model data with relationships, context, and meaning. And normally an ontology will form triples or triple stores, which are statements that are structured as subject, object, predicate.
Awesome. Thank you. That helps a lot to frame making sure everyone's on the same page with taxonomy. And I'm going to hand it over to Andy now. What are how do you describe what good data quality looks like? And can you set the stage there with maybe some frameworks on measuring data quality, and what good data quality actually looks like in actual practice.
Yeah, and I think the first thing that I would say is that when you hear data quality, everybody should thinking about it more broadly than just the typical ways that we look at quality once we have the data. We should really be thinking about it as data quality plus provenance, right? So what is the source of the data? How close to first party data or zero party data is it? And what do we know about the company that's providing the data? So I think about this, there's an easy way to think about internal data, which we can look at from the traditional quality perspective because we know where it came from. And then there's a lot of external data that comes into the organization that comes with its own set of risks and costs. So we have to deal with that separately as we blend those together. So the provenance and quality work very well together. I would say, as I look at it, focusing on source of data, the completeness of the data set, and the consistency of the information within that data set is really table stakes. And then we can look at 40 different factors that build off of those things in terms of making sure that the data is valuable. And we do have to measure that, which we can talk about as we go along in this conversation. But it's really that focus on provenance and quality that matters.
Gotcha. That makes sense. And so, data quality, taxonomy have been very big topics for a while in this space. I'm sure everyone on this call has seen many a LinkedIn post about data quality outcomes, taxonomy, data structures. So Jessica and Andy, I want to ask you both, and maybe I'll hand this off to Jessica first and then Andy. Where are you both seeing the biggest disconnect between how people are talking about trustworthy AI and data practices with what's actually happening? Sort of where is that gap between what people are talking about what needs to be done and what's actually being done with both taxonomy, ontologies, and data quality?
Well, firstly, I see the businesses and LinkedIn in general. If we look at the conversations happening there, the disconnect. There's a disparity between what we're talking about. We obviously see a need for data quality, and that data quality is suffering. Yet businesses are not investing in data quality. So without funding and without investment and priorities and actual people that are assigned to the task of helping to curate and refine and structure, data quality is not going to find itself. And so the businesses really need to invest in both human capital and obviously financial investment in tools and processes. Another disconnect is that data quality is not a one and done. It's a continuous iterative process. So, most of us have dreams of automating data quality, and that can be done after processes are set in place to a certain extent, but there always has to be a human in the loop. And so it's mostly, one of the reasons being that there can be some ambiguous, if the underlying data sets are ambiguous or really poorly defined, AI is going to be guessing. And ultimately, taxonomies and ontologies profile your business. It's creating a persona essentially out of your business. And so, if you want AI to kind of guess at what that persona is and form that identity for you, that's fine, but it's problematic because there are so many nuances to company data and determining what's important and what's not within a large data set. Data can be very noisy. And so one of the reasons we want to structure and refine these vocabularies, taxonomies, and ontologies is as attention mechanisms to draw AI's attention towards what is important to the business.
I would add on to that. So what I hear a lot is how important the integration of artificial intelligence, machine learning into our processes, right? So into our work streams, into our technology so that we can get better outputs. And so there is a vision that says, hey, this can be groundbreaking. I think so there's a rhetoric that doesn't yet drive down into the realities. And I think that is the piece. The rhetoric's important, but where is the investment? like Jessica said, where is the investment in every part of the structure to get that value out of AI? And that starts at ground level, which is data. And it's just not about, I mean, taxonomy is so critical, ontology is so critical. So when we just say quality, we can miss those two pieces because that's the future, how all this data interconnects. And I think that people are desirous of this great outcome with this technology, but don't yet understand sort of at the base of that what has to be done to be successful with this technology and with the fuel that drives this engine, which is the data. So I think when we look at companies, are they putting the money where their mouth is? Are they hiring the right people? Are they putting the right structures in? And that's where we have to start. The talk is important because if the CEO or the C-level is not saying, "Hey, this is important," and data quality is the engine or is the fuel for the engine, we're going to go nowhere. But then it's the actual execution. And I think that's what a lot of what Jessica and us, we at Blue Street Data really focus on is helping companies get there.
Yeah, that's great. So Andy and Jessica follow up to that, and I'll bounce back to Jessica first and then Andy. When evaluating a data set for AI or when going to build ontologies or taxonomy structures inside organizations, what are the indicators of success that you look for in those? So Jessica, when you're going to build out structured data systems and structures, what does sort of success look like for those? And then Andy, in data quality, specifically for AI, what does success look like there?
That's a really interesting question because in some cases it can be a non-starter. And what I mean by that is back to the investment. We then have to work on, within organizations, we have many organizations that are really reliant on relational database models. And so we have these structures that are kind of confined and constricted by its own rule bases, rule engines in terms of primary keys, foreign keys, tables, rows. Taxonomies and ontologies break out of that constraint. They model data agnostic to those dependencies. It's a different type of logic. So part of success is that investment and working on integrations. That's where I see the great opportunity is how do we integrate this so that it's usable and useful throughout a system. You have to support those integrations in whatever shape or form. Metadata is one, and metadata schemas is one place where we can support integration. So success would be integrating and making it usable throughout the organization. And then beyond that, you have coverage and coverage models. So those coverage models, when you build a taxonomy and ontology, you want to make sure that those data models actually represent and have sufficient coverage for whatever's in the organization that you're trying to capture. It could be content, for example, where you want to leverage content. It could be representing tables and rows in a non-relational database format. There's lots of different, you could be wanting to retrieve and discover new concepts within an ecosystem, which means you have to build and represent more than what your data internally represents. So there's lots of different ways in which it can be these things can be measured and tracked to a certain extent, sort of like observability type dashboards. And there's lots of different models that can follow, but the second part is that these things need to be measurable. And so useful, measurable, and coverage models.
Yeah, that is so well said. I mean, I in my mind, what I'm thinking about is sort of this layer cake, and on top of this layer, you have what is the objectives that you're trying to achieve with these models at the very highest level, and we have to ask ourselves if we're doing these, if we're assembling these models and building these frameworks, are we getting the business value out of what we're putting together? The second layer is that model itself. Is it performing, right? Is it running well? And the third layer is the fuel that we're putting into these models that, the data, is it actually feeding the engines with what we want? And I've had number of conversations with organizations that are saying, well, you know what, I'm going to focus on the output of the model. And that's the only thing that matters. And because everything else, if I got good output, what does it matter what the data looks like at the end of the day? And my response to that is always, how do you know if you're not focused on the data in the same way that you're focused on the outputs, how do you know whether or not you're covering the population that you want to be covering, that it's a fulsome representation of what you're trying to achieve? So you can still get good outcomes on a limited set of data, but that's not really telling you about the population. So I think success, as we think about it, is that you understand all three of those layers, and then you have, like Jessica said, an objective way to measure against that. So let's take, for example, the metadata piece of it is incredibly important around data sets that you're using. That tells us everything about it. It tells us the origin, how the data was assembled, whether or not we're allowed to use the data for a particular purpose, et cetera, ad nauseum. But that data, once you build that metadata around that data set, now you have an incredibly powerful tool. And what we need are standards in terms of what do you need to measure against. And that's why I'm really proud to be part of an organization called Oasis Open, where we're sponsoring a technical committee along with IBM and Microsoft and Cisco and others to set these data provenance standards related to that metadata that surrounds data sets that gives us not only confidence, but it's also the basis, as Jessica talks about, for us to understand a relationship between data across the organization. That's what that metadata really allows us to do.
Yeah, that's great, Andy. And my next question was going to be sort of what frameworks exist for measuring against. So
Sorry.
that was a great segue. Jessica, I want to ask you a similar question. Might not be on the measurement side, but just on sort of what frameworks exist that are industry standards for taxonomy or ontology. Do those exist, or are those in development right now?
They've existed for years. So these are not new innovations. They've existed since the very, very late 90s, early 2000s. So we have ONSI Z39.19, and that is actually considered a guideline, but it's an ISO and is important. It's about structuring monolingual vocabularies and thesauri. So that's very, very important guideline that declares sort of the machine readable and interoperable view of these data models, taxonomies, and thesauri and controlled vocabularies. Then ontologies naturally, especially the open ontologies, are W3C compliant. Even RDF, Resource Descriptive Framework, which is sort of the micro format in which we express ontologies, that's a W3C standard. So there are standards related, and ontologies really are standards based. That's the difference, is that we naturally have implementation of standards, and as logical data models, these things like SHACL, which is another standard, can help to validate ontologies. So ontologies also, if we look at SCOS, which is a W3C standard, concept model, data model, ontology, very, very lightweight and technically an OWL full ontology. SCOS is simple knowledge organization system is another standard that helps to shape taxonomies and thesauri.
That's great to know. And Jessica, I'm going to pose one more question back to you here. So to align with those frameworks, what practical steps can data teams or leaders take to make sure that they're, staying up to date with any changes that are happening and across an organization, making sure that they're, getting everyone together and on the same page about being in line with those frameworks?
Yeah, so it does take some upskilling and education, and that's just the truth. It's we tend to skip to wanting the end result again pretty quickly and automating, which unfortunately AI is not very reliable for structuring these for structuring taxonomies and ontologies. I've had some pretty funny experiences trying to force AI to structure taxonomy and have it be compliant. So it's really about upskilling and education, investment from the business, and starting with your most simple model. So data cleaning and structuring a controlled vocabulary, which can just be a flat list, is where you start. You don't start out at the gate trying to structure ontologies on just a given data set because that data set may not logically make sense and it may not be well defined. So I do teach and have a framework called Ontology Pipeline, and that is meant to bring people iteratively through the steps of building. And what I mean by iteratively is once you've structured your ontology, I see this all too often where then teams think, okay, we're done. They sort of absolve themselves of having to do any more work on structuring. But businesses are dynamic, they're not static. And data is constantly evolving, changing. You're getting new, there's need for deprecation and introducing new data and data types and formats. And so, an acknowledgement and embracing the fact that this is a long-term investment, but it's continued iterative work. It's something that has, that educational piece, that educational investment in people is fundamental to making taxonomies and ontologies a viable part of a data ecosystem.
That's great.
Kate, I just want to add something on to it because I think what's really interesting is we know how important sort of structure and standards are in what we do, but at the same time, what I'm so intrigued about is what we're doing here almost has a living quality to it. Right. So I don't want to get too deeply into philosophical things around AI, but it is constantly when we implement these systems, they are constantly learning, constantly evolving. And we have to think about in that environment, how are we understanding sort of how that change and involvement comes back to the structure and standards. They have to live together. They can't, it's not separate. It's not like, oh, I'm going to structure my data and everything's going to be great. And I'm going to put this, I'm going to understand the taxonomy and all the metadata, and then it's going to be great. It doesn't work that way. It is constantly, think about it as almost partially living, constantly changing, constantly learning.
That's great. Yeah, I love that analogy. Andy, I want to ask you the same question as a follow-up there. What practical steps can either data teams or data leaders take to, to stay aligned with frameworks like the Oasis Open framework you were talking about, any others that you know of to score or measure data quality? What does that first step look like to integrating a framework for that or scoring data quality?
Yeah, I'm going to repeat a little bit because it's so important. I mean, it has to be a priority for the organization, which means that the C-level part of an organization has to be committed in order committed to the everything from the data structure to the metadata around it. So that number one is that. And commitment and verbal expression of that is really important, but it's then do the dollars follow? Are you making the investments in the right technology, the right infrastructure, the right people in order to do that? And then I think it starts with understanding what I've been really surprised about is the lack of understanding of that data comes in multiple flavors, meaning that some comes from outside the organization, some comes from inside the organization or across parts of the organization. We can't think about that just as data. We need to understand the risks and the costs related to the different types of data. So I think that understanding, that fundamental understanding, is still not quite there. I mean, I think most people on this call may be surprised to know that purchase data is totaling somewhere north of $500 billion a year. That is a big market. So, okay, are we thinking about that as a purchase strategic asset? So I think there's a mindset that needs to sort of be, I think, proliferated throughout business and other organizations. And then it is to say, okay, how are we going to, what are the most important things? Like from the internal side, I had a conversation with Steve Turk at JP Morgan, and he is so fixated on making sure the organization has a single source of truth that's not static, meaning that people outside of that single source of truth can contribute into that single source of truth. So it's not the old definition of single source of truth, it's sort of this new definition. And then from an external data perspective, we need to then start to say, okay, what matters? What matters is provenance, quality, and cost, and then using measurement tools like the data provenance standards and software behind that to be able to measure those standards.
That's great. Yeah. All right, we've got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to switch over to some audience questions here. One that just came in. This is a great one. Some aspects of classification and data quality feel subjective. What's the best way to evaluate and align these more qualitative factors? I'm going to hand it over to Jessica first, and then Andy, unless you guys want to swap.
I always, and this is something that I do personally in my practice, is I expand my model. So you have to have a handle on where your business fits in within the domain and marketplace outside of relative to your internal organization. So when you say subjective, an example of that is often internal definitions of things that we're trying to represent and define in taxonomies and ontologies don't match the common definitions of things. And so what we see is sort of a disconnect with the actual market. And that can be marketing and branding. Often within companies, we'll come up with these nuanced terms that are great for marketing and branding pitches. But in terms of a language model, these are language models. They're trained mostly on the open internet. And so who do you think that language models are going to work or understand the sort of the model for understanding is going to be the internet and how the internet defines these things, not how your internal business defines these things. So it's really important in terms of objectivity that we look outside of our sort of microcosms and that we extend and understand definitions that are commonly used within the open space. I always use the example of accessories. Accessories can vary widely. What type of accessory, a computer accessory, a baby accessory, a pet accessory, like it can go on and on. And so the objectivity of a data set comes from matching the open world with your closed world.
So subjectivity can be sort of a really big problem, especially whenever, so if we think about data that we want to bring into the organization and, and it's going across multiple organizations, that subjectivity on how we view it doesn't lead us to getting a level playing field of the data that we're bringing into the organization, because subjectivity in terms of measurement or definition or whatever, it really clouds up the ability for us to get an efficient market around data. And so the more objective that we can get, common definitions, common contracts, for goodness sake. I think that's one thing that we're going to see over the next few years is that we're going to have common language in contracts that are standard that help us, easily obtain and use data. And so I think there's a lot to be said about, let's stamp out subjectivity from a perspective of what we need to measure and what's important to the organization. And it always will be dynamic. It's there, so it has to be a flexible sort of system that allows us to change definitions or measurements as we learn more about the space. But I think the important thing is that drive to objectivity allows us to get more value out of our data. And I'd say the entire industries that we work in to get more value out of data.
That's great. All right, we are right at the close of our webinar today.
It was fast.
So yeah, if we did not get a chance to answer your question, please reach out to either Andy or Jessica or our team here at Blue Street Data. I sent a couple of resources in the chat. The OASIS Open Data Standards link is there to explore. Jessica's website on the ontology pipeline is there as well to explore that further. And then I'm sending a couple more here. Email to reach our team with any questions, or if you want to set up any time to walk through data quality frameworks or a data evaluation with our team. A free resource from our team, a data buyer's guide. That's a 12-step framework for evaluating data quality and buying data. So data procurement, but more standardized. And then Jessica's newsletter is there as well. Thank you both, Andy and Jessica, for joining today. This was great. And thank you everyone who signed on.
All right, thanks, Jessica. Thanks, Kate.
That was great.
Thanks. Bye, guys.
Bye.